Obviously I'm at Harper. I'd love you all to send me questions and kind of reach out and definitely continue the conversation. Today I'm going to talk about a few things, really three things. It's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to be talking about building a great community. I'm going to be talking about practicing failure, which I think is really important, and then facilitating, or I guess building a great team and then facilitating community. But first, I want to talk about my most favorite thing in the world, myself. How many of you guys know who these people are? Anyone here? Okay, a few. So this is the first computer that I ever got. It's an Apple IIc. I was not a very old person when I got it. And I learned to program, and I did a lot of kind of just standard, like, I'm a tech person, I'm going to program on computers stuff, where I built little video games with my brother. How many know this book? This was a very important book for me. Has anyone read it? One person? You guys should all read this book because it's basically a history book about hackers. And really when I say hackers, I mean the people who built the world that we live in today. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, etc. And so this book talks a lot about kind of the hacker ethic. And some of these things are like sharing, open source or openness, collaboration, and this idea of the hands-on imperative. We're like, or how do we just make sure we're constantly working, fixing, etc. And the idea here is when there's a locked door, I want to open the door to see if I can open it, not to see what's on the other side. It's really exciting stuff. But I realized after reading this book and kind of programming for a few years that I was a hacker. And in my world, hacker is pretty much synonymous with coder. And so this is a really important point. But now that you know a little bit about where I come from, I want to talk a little bit about threadless. How many here know threadless? Threadless has always been a little bit of a darling from the marketing folks because we were so crazy early on. We started out in about 2001, and about 2004 we were invited to MIT where they said, and here's threadless, they invented crowdsourcing, and we were like, crowd what? We had no idea what they were talking about. But you know, it was very, very simple. We took this and turned it into this. That's not so crazy, but we did it with, obviously, the crowd. And so we had four very simple steps. The first one was design. You, people like yourselves, would upload a great design, and then we would submit it. It would be submitted, you would submit it, and then people, the crowd, would obviously score it. And then cash money would rain from the ceiling, both for us, and then we would pay people, obviously, for their designs. And this worked out very, very well. We did absolutely hundreds of thousands of designs uploaded, millions and millions of votes. We sold millions of t-shirts, and I have been instructed not to talk about revenue, so this is my demonstration of our growth during that time. But the best part about this was, with crowdsourcing, we did none of the actual work, none of the hard work. We didn't have to create anything. All we did was facilitate money and logistics, which honestly is pretty well defined and pretty well solved. And the people out, you know, the crowd did all of the hard stuff. We had a very simple technology stack. We used PHP, MySQL. The idea here was keep it easy, keep it simple, because we want to just focus on the product. We did not want to focus on the technology. We didn't want to have to invent anything. All we wanted to do is focus on the most important part. Around this time, I realized I had accomplished everything that I wanted to accomplish. So I did the one thing that makes the most sense, which is I quit. And I went on a vision quest. Who here knows what a vision quest is? I find this very fascinating. So in the US, when I say that, everyone raises their hand and they imagine Homer Simpson on some like path through a desert doing peyote and talking to coyotes. Here in Europe, no one has any idea what we're talking about, but it really is when you go into the desert and you find your spirit animal, usually through narcotics. For me, this was, I just joined a VC firm for a little while and kind of figured out what it was I wanted to do. So after quite a while, much to the chagrin of my wife, I found this new job. Well, actually, they found me. And it was kind of a crazy thing, because I never thought, hey, I want to do politics. Does anyone here have experience in campaigns or politics? Okay, a little more than the people who knew what a vision quest was, so I think it's about the same thing. But this was Michael Slaby, and Michael Slaby, as you can see, or he was the CTO of 2008, and as you can see, he looks like you would imagine someone in a campaign. He wears a blazer, he has button-up shirts, and he was the CTO in 2008. And so this is me. This was quite a shock, I think, this kind of And they, walking in, this is actually an official campaign photo, which was also really fun. And I did that, and then they uploaded it, and I think everyone was just like, what is happening? But there was a lot of conversation about what people need to solve the problem. And there's a lot of conversation about what the problem is, what the problem was that we were trying to solve. And so, you know, you guys know what this is? YOLO? Okay, this is my favorite slide because everyone's just like, I'm not gonna acknowledge that it says YOLO on the screen. But I always bring it up because I think it's funny. So the real question here is why did they choose me? Why did they choose that kind of crazy looking guy? And I was talking to my wife, who's from Japan, and she was like, oh, it's very simple, it's this. And I was like, well, I don't know Japanese. And it's mochi wa mochi ya, which really just means for rice cakes, you go to the rice cakes dealer. Which, if you translate that into what we're talking about today, if you want engineering, you should go get the engineers. For some reason, this is insanely illuminating and really innovative. And when people say, like, what did you do? It's like, well, I hired engineers. Like, I didn't really do anything. Like, we just got people who could actually do the job. And I think this is very akin to kind of, how many here do e-marketing? Okay, how many here do marketing? You better all have the same number of hands up. I remember I was once, they were like, do you want to be an e-marketing professor? And I was like, well, call me when it's just marketing. Because I think that's right now, right? Like, we're in the world where we've dropped the E. And so in 2008, I think you could talk about this as it was e-politics. And then they just realized that it's just business as usual. And so what did I do? I really just hired engineers, honestly. I did recruiting. We hired about 40 engineers from all these great companies. There's one I want to point out. We had about 120 tech staff. Now, the interesting thing here is it was a straight 10 times the tech staff we had in 2008. We had about 4 engineers. We had about 12 just general tech staff. We just, you know, multiplied it by 10, and then we had this other interesting thing, which we started by 0. I was introduced as having to rewrite everything, but it wasn't. We just didn't have anything. I think there was a big victory, like Pyre in 2008, where they burnt all the source code, because we didn't start with anything. We started with, I guess, a few things. US politics is very strange. We have this thing called the DNC. It just kind of sits in the corner and doesn't really do anything. And so we didn't have any code or anything to start with. But the only thing we did know was we knew we had 18 months. And 18 months is not a long time, but it seems like forever when you're at the beginning. It didn't seem like very long when we were, 17 months in. So because we had 18 months, we only had one thing that we needed to do. And we kind of knew what we were going to do because it's a campaign. It's pretty well defined. Remember, the innovation was adding the engineers. It wasn't making new things. And so we had a very clear charter. This is pretty much it. This is also the first thing that Jim Messina, the campaign manager, said to me when I walked in the door. He's like, glad to have you, don't fuck it up, and then he left. So we did one thing, and one thing only with all of these great engineers. We built a platform. We called this platform Narwhal, and it got a lot of press. Are there any Redditors here? Okay. There's one Redditor. So anyway, so this is our narwhal. This is Jim Messina photoshopped as a narwhal. This is him as Harry Potter, as a giraffe, and as a dragon. So the reason I have these is I wanted to take a little bit of an interlude and just talk about, we used a lot of humor to kind of dissolve the trust deficit that we had between tech and the regular campaign, because we came in kind of as the outsiders. And there was no way that they were going to identify with us, because remember the first couple slides with Slavey, who was actually my boss, and myself. There was a lot that they could easily see, hey, these are outsiders. And so there's no way to kind of get through or talk to each other. We had some incommensurable issues, but through humor we were able to do it. So anyway, back to Narwhal. Narwhal was this idea of a concept, and it was a very simple concept. It was just an API. And we used this API as a foundation, and we really wanted to build something that allowed us to build anything, to say it really strangely. It was really what gave us the freedom to do the one thing that was most important, which was to focus on the products. And we had some very simple products that would probably be illegal in Europe because of data laws. The call tool, and what this was is you just log on, it would show a number and all sorts of personal information, which would obviously be illegal in Germany, and then you would go through and basically play Mad Libs over the phone while you call someone. And it worked out really well, and we were doing millions and millions of calls towards the end of election day. We had Dashboard, which was an online, it was kind of like for those of us, you all work in biggish companies, yes? It was a CRM mixed with a business process management app, which if I said that to anyone in the campaign, their eyes would glaze over and they'd fall on the ground. But really what it was a way for our offline and online volunteers to merge. So if you went and walked into a field office, you had the same experience as if you went on the internet. And what was really exciting about this is we had a lot of people who were either differently abled or in a rural area or just didn't want to go into a field office, and they were able to have the same experience. My favorite story about Dashboard is we had an email from a veteran who had just come back from Afghanistan, and he was able to volunteer for the president's campaign in a way that was really important to him. And he was unable to do that by walking into a field office, and he was able to do it on the internet. And he emailed us and said, thank you for allowing me to do this. And it was like, well, we have to let you do this. This is really important. So in our mobile apps are another thing that would probably be illegal in Europe. This was a app that you would load up on your mobile phone, Android or iPhone or whatever, and then it would allow you to go and knock on doors and enter data about how successful that was. Contribution, we built a very quick contribution platform that raised $200 million. I was looking at this right at the end of the campaign trying to do some little ROI on it, and I think it cost about $800 to host. So it was a pretty good ROI. Social, we did a lot of social stuff, and I'm not going to talk much about that, but I'll get into it in a little bit. And my favorite, big data. Who here uses big data? Oh, once again, all of your hands should be up. We heard a little bit about big data earlier. So one of the biggest innovations we had was big data, but first I want to do a little bit of an intervention. I call this the intermission intervention. And the reason is because we talk about big data a lot. We talk about big in the data, but that's bullshit. Really, it's just data. And the reason that is because we've solved the big. We just saw this dude stream like terabytes of information to a browser. We no longer care about big. So when you're talking about data, don't say big, just say data, because the real thing is we need to focus on answers. Once again, this amazing demo was talking about answers, and we need to talk about big answers. And I want that to be a conversation when we talk about big data, because oftentimes, especially tech people, we focus so much on the big, and it's just not, this doesn't matter anymore. Okay, I'm done with that. So anyway, the innovation was obviously the data, right? Here's a little example of kind of what happens in the US when we talk about data. So this is kind of, this is a Google search for Obama campaign data. It's pretty boring. Now let's change it up a little bit to my favorite search terms ever. Obama campaign micro-targeting. What? What does that even mean? So obviously what we can tell here is micro-targeting is very, very exciting. So this is Dan Sinker. I don't know if you guys know who Dan Sinker is. He works for Mozilla. He's a great guy. But the funny thing about this tweet, I think I have a laser on here, is it's in 2008. Nothing has changed in regards to kind of what we've done with email. We've always sent a lot of email. Did anyone here randomly get emails from the campaign in the US? Okay. Did you sign up? Okay, yes, okay. I was gonna say, because otherwise I'd have a bigger problem. But the thing about the emails, we used a lot of the targeting that we've talked about today in our emails. And we just did it blatantly. Like there's this great $56. Like, that's so weird. I love how it's all nicely ordered, and obviously, 56. So then we looked at this. This is just kind of what we have always done. The innovation here actually was Quick Donate, which was just you clicked a link and gave money, which I don't know why more companies aren't doing that in their emails, just immediately making the conversion point at the email. It worked really, really well. So we took all this kind of technology that we had with micro-targeting, and we added Facebook to it, and then we tried to make it really personal. So this is an email I received. This is an actual real email. It's right when North Carolina started voting. And John Ruth here is actually my best friend from growing up. And we still talk, but he lives in another state. I live in Chicago, Illinois. That was almost Dan Quayle moment where I said Chicago was a state. Don't worry about that. He lives in North Carolina, and and it has all this personalization here, and it's really nice because we sent this and people were like, oh, I'll call John immediately. This worked tremendously. No one thought it was creepy, even though Paxman thought it was. We did this with text message and SMS. Same technology, just a different channel. It was pretty easy. So we talked about this a lot. Hey, we're going to do this with text messages. It's going to be really easy. And this is pretty much how it worked. This is how I thought it was going to work. I was sure that we were going to have a bug, and because it's so easy to give a lot of money, that we're just going to rock through it. And then since it worked so well, we ended up doing it on New Year's Eve, which was awesome because it's New Year's Eve. But it was that same type of thing, right, where it was, it really, boatloads is a technical term. You guys should start using this. But we raised so much money off of these very simple things, and one of the biggest reasons is because we made sure the conversion was closer to the user. We made sure that we used intelligence and targeting to give the user the best option, even though they sometimes didn't know it. And it allowed us to do better content distribution. We were able to say, hey, very simply, we're trying to hit you with this info, take it, and personalized it. And then it allowed us to do voter contact much more efficiently. But that's really awesome. One of the problems that we found was we needed to listen as well. So I had a conversation with this guy. Does anyone know who this is? This is Tim O'Reilly. Does anyone know O'Reilly Publishing? They do all the tech books and all sorts of stuff. So Tim O'Reilly said to me, hey, you need to do micro-listening. No more micro-targeting. I'm tired of this. And this is a very simple idea. How do we use targeting to get closer to the user and have that conversation? We talked a little bit about this earlier, but I think that the important thing here is just how do we make sure that it's one-on-one in a very real way? And we can do this in many, many ways. We did this very simply with voter contact, where we had people go and knock on doors and literally have a conversation with someone and then report that information back that then we used to build profiles. Same with calling people. This is a very simple thing as well, where we made all of our calls made with whichever call tool we had, all that data was put back into that person's profile. This is a really great example of Twitter and how we use this to kind of stoke a conversation by us reaching out first. And what we did is we had the First Lady and the President and Vice President all send messages, DM messages to various Twitter accounts. These were not... We have one verified guy, Snoop Dogg. Maybe you guys have heard of Snoop Dogg. But most of the people were just regular Twitter users who happened to have followers that we thought we should hit so that they would tweet things like this. Feeling special because I got a DM from Joe Biden. He's kind of like America's drunk uncle. But the next one we did is we did a lot of asking. And this is something that I don't see a lot of brands doing, is just straight asking. We did this very simply in our dashboard product, which once again was our CRM BPM product. And all we did is just ask them very simple things, straight up metrics. We knew we couldn't trust these metrics, so we just called them different. We called them soft metrics. We paired these with hard metrics, where the exact same numbers but not reported. And then we were able to tell all sorts of interesting things about our users, who to trust, who was better, where there were problems with any of our metrics recording, all these various things. And we would never have done this if we wouldn't have simply just asked. This is a great example of something that's really built into the campaign. This was not an innovation. They would have done this for years. We just added it to the internet and made it very easy. We also did a lot of testing. We invested very heavily in user experience, and that's one of the #1 things that I learned coming out of the campaign is how important user experience is. Infrastructure, we had a huge amount of infrastructure. I almost died just now. We had about 200 deployed products. We had thousands and thousands of servers. We had a very simple technology stack, and I know there's not a lot of tech people here, so I'll go through it quickly. The idea here was we just want to use kind of the simple stuff, and so we used all the things. And there's a very simple reason for this. It's very, very easy. We just wanted to focus on the product once again. The thing that solves, we didn't want to focus on the very simple thing, no religion. We just needed to use the technology that solved the problem that was right in front of us. I often hear a lot of organizations say we have all this technology we use. A great example is StatsD. Does anyone know what StatsD is? It is a zero cost, very free stats aggregation platform that's amazing. So if you're trying to tag various things to learn metrics of, or insight inside of your apps, it's not going to compete with like what we saw earlier or any of the general BI tools, but for tech it's great. It's free. But we just needed that just because we wanted to know how many people were like hovering over this thing or how many people were clicking on this thing. We didn't want to have to buy something. We also had no money. But it was very easy to just rock through that. And there was a huge thing which is failure was not an option. So we could not be religious about our technology. User experience, I talked briefly about that. We invested so much in user experience. I have this about 8 times in my presentation where I say the same thing. Please go hug your user experience professional today. And we often treat them like terribly because they're talking to users and the users are a pain in the ass. But for the most part, they are a very important connection that we need to acknowledge. Testing was really important. We practiced failure for 1 whole month where we actually went through and failed all of our systems and aggressively broke everything, including many engineers. But the real thing is we practiced constantly. We never stopped practicing. Election day was pretty crazy. This is that little puppy was placed on the wall, and you'd walk by it every day because it was really insane. But luckily, we had something on our side, which was we could do no more changes. So really, it was very, very chilled out. And we won. You guys are supposed to applaud. So I learned a couple things here, but I think the biggest thing I learned is that politics is hard, and really this should have a little p instead of a big P. But does anyone know who this is? John Maeda. He's a president of RISD. He came into my office in this really funny kind of whirlwind of a visit where he flew in. The campaign had a lot of VIPs that would come in, and it would be anything from Vince Carter to Anna Wintour to Jay-Z or whomever. And they would come in and they would just kind of hang out. And trying to think what a good example. You ever see the movie Boiler Room? You know how they have just that huge area full of cubicles and everyone's on the phone and they're all yelling and running around? That's like what the campaign was. It wasn't the empty room with all the phones where the conspiracy was, no. It was the other one where it was just so busy, very open. The average age was about 24. We once onboarded 150 interns one day. We just stacked them in the corners like firewood. So people coming in wasn't very strange, but what's strange about this is they were like, Harper, he wants about 2 hours, and we were like, oh, well, that's quite a bit of time when you only have 18 months, and this is just a random dude, we don't know what he's going to talk about, but he's very important, and he has a really good sense for design, and we didn't know if he was going to come in and say, hey, I have this great idea, or I want to give you a lot of money. But he came in and said this, very simple, managed by your outbox, not by your inbox. And he comes in and he basically says, Harper, I'm positive that you're dealing with a lot of politics with a little p. I'm positive that you're probably dealing with a lot of contentious conversations, a lot of relationships that aren't quite working out. I'm sure because you're an outsider that's trying to invoke change inside, that this isn't very fun. And he says, at RISD, I had a lot of the similar problems. Like there's a lot of things that I was trying to do that I wasn't able to do because of the institution that I was working within. And he said, but this is how I solve this. The idea is that oftentimes as change agents, or oftentimes, I'll say this a little easier, oftentimes as technologists, we're not very good at communicating. And his suggestion was simply reach out. And I was just like, well, that seems really stupid. Like, just email them. And he's like, well, yeah. So the idea is look at who you aren't emailing, and that's where your contentious relationships often are. And he had these really great visualizations for this. So a couple weeks go by, he leaves, he just runs out of my office. The meeting was 2 hours, supposed to be 2 hours. I have 2 hours on my calendar. It was like 15 minutes. It was hilarious. He literally runs out of my office. A couple weeks go by, and I'm thinking about this a lot, and there's a specific relationship that is kind of hard and contentious. And I'm like, fuck it, I'll try it out. Sent this dude an email that was just like, hey, hope everything's going well. The project seems like it's working. How are you feeling? And his response was, thank you so much for emailing me. Like, that's it. Like, he was just like, thank you for doing your job. It was really strange. But from then on, I constantly emailed out and managed my relationships by my outbox, and everything was much easier. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat. So I have 3 important lessons. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but building a great team, practicing failure, and facilitating community. The reason I want to talk about these things is because these are the things that have allowed us to do everything we've done. We talked earlier about how the technology is this is not crazy tech. We don't have to be a giant company with all these resources to do all this really cool stuff. However, there's a couple things that we absolutely need. We need a great team. The innovation here was aggressively the team. Bringing the people into the organization and organizing them in such a way where they are successful, removing the hurdles, etc., was the innovation. Except this is not easy. How many here have a really great team? How many here work on a great team? Okay, good number. How many people here don't work on a great team? So everyone laughs, but the thing is there's always people that raise their hand. And I think this is something this is very hard, and I think once you've identified you're not on a great team, that's really tricky. We'll talk a little bit about this. How do we do this? The first thing is pruning. This is probably the hardest, and I put this first because it's definitely the hardest for me personally. We cannot be afraid to fire people. You have to do this. If there's someone that's terrible on your organization, just get rid of them. Culturally, this is sometimes a pain in the butt, and it always is frustrating, and it always sucks. But this doesn't mean that you're like destroying them or putting them out of your life, or you'll never talk to them again. At Threadless, we got rid of someone, and then I later hired them at the campaign. Because at Threadless, he didn't fit at the campaign. He was perfect for the job. He flourished, and now he's doing great, and I'd probably work with him again. It just means that in this point in time, it's not working out. Who's seen this movie? Glengarry Gillen Ross? I've never seen it. But there's a really important point here, which is always be closing, right? When you're talking about your product, and we see this all the time, we're so tech, we're so in the product, we don't actually step out and see what problems we're solving. Oftentimes when I talk to startups, they're often like, hey, I'm trying to find an engineer. And you're like, okay, well, what's the pitch? And they're like, well, we have a Ruby's on Rails app and where it's really boring. They never tell about the big problem. And I know that we all have huge problems to solve. So really, instead of always be closing, which you constantly have to be always pitching, always hustling, you need to be creative about what your problems are. This is harder than it seems because we're so close. It's like we're staring at the sun. We need to step back so we can see the whole picture. But there's another A's hire, or another one with ABC, which is A's hire A's and B's hire C's. This is very simple. That's it. Just hire people who are smarter than yourself. This is not as easy, oftentimes because it's scary when you're hiring someone who's way better at yourself, but I tried to hire everyone that I knew who would be better at my job than I was, specifically because I didn't really want to do any work. This was a very easy thing to quantify. If I hire them to do my work, then I don't have to do it. I, of course, have to manage them, which is a whole different ball of wax, but this worked out very well because it meant that we had all these people who are insanely good, and if one person fell or if one person wasn't able to work it out, the other people could help lift them up. This was huge. Another little funny thing about these last couple things, these all came from Donald Rumsfeld, who is not necessarily politically aligned with myself, and he had a thing called Rumsfeld's Rules, which I think is a book coming out soon, and I was like reading through the list of things, and I was like, oh, these are all in my presentation. How awkward. So trust is really, really important. I always have a hard time talking about this because I know why trust is important for me, and it's like important to make sure that you can, because especially when you're hiring all these people and you hope that one person can fill in for another person, etc. You kind of hope that we are all peers, etc. These are all really important things. But I would love you guys to tweet at me or send me an email with your stories about why trust is important for a team. I do this every time I talk. I always say, hey, email me these stories, and I get these amazing stories, and I'm hoping one day one is just small enough and easy enough to put on a slide. Because trust is such an important thing that I don't want to have some silly anecdote or something about it. It's just something that you need to find and develop and build within your organization, within your team. On the campaign, we measured absolutely everything. This is actually a graph from Graphite, which is a really cool graph program. But we measured absolutely everything. I was joking earlier that someone once asked, what metrics did you keep? And I was like, well, it's easier to talk about what metrics we didn't keep. We measured everything for a couple really easy reasons. One, we wanted to celebrate success. So every single Friday, we would basically have a whole team meeting, and we would sit down and we would talk about all the successes of that week. We'd talk about all the successes of the month, and we just kind of expand out until we were basically having a party every Friday. This allowed us to have a very granular view of what we were biting off. Because we could not screw it up, we could not fuck it up in those famous words on that cake, of which I forgot to tell the story of. So we got the cake, I'll just tell it real quick. They got the cake and right before Election Day, and then no one would eat it. Because they were really scared that what happens if they ate the cake that said that and then we lost? Like, it'd just be terrible bad luck. And then, so like a week goes by and we win, and then there's a stale cake. So then everyone's like, well, we have to celebrate and eat the cake. And I was like, cool, not gonna do that. But they did, So we celebrated success, and we needed to do this, so we did this every single week. And one of the other components of this is how do you give credit? We also gave credit where credit was really important. So you have this idea of success. Oh, this is great, we won this thing, we launched this thing, we're close to launching it. Harper did it, or whatever. I tried to do things. They wouldn't really let me touch code, so I acted like I did things. But we really tried to celebrate the people who did it, because that way those people are excited. And there's a great book about this stuff called Drive by Daniel Pink. Has anyone read it? Great book. There's a TED Talk, which I think he even says just summarizes the book in like 10 minutes, so you should probably watch that instead of read the book. But the idea here is like the pat on the back is really important, and so we tried to codify that within our organization, within our community. Diversity, is this an issue in the UK? Diversity in the workplace? Okay, good. I was looking at the women, they're all saying yes, and then finally the guys are like, yeah, it's all, yeah. So it's good. In the US, this is a really important thing that we're really struggling with, and I didn't do a very good job of hiring people that didn't look like me on the campaign. I mean, they didn't look exactly like me, but there were a lot of white guys with beards. And the reason was because that's pretty much who's building big apps, who's coming from Google, who's coming from these places. We tried really hard to hire people that didn't look like me. It was not easy. We basically failed. But through this experience, I learned a couple things. The first one is you have to try. That's the number one thing here. You cannot just say, oh, it's hard, we'll do it later, etc. You need to sit there and you need to make sure that you are interviewing, that you're talking to, that you're recruiting people that don't look like you. You also need to talk about it. There's a great example of Etsy. Everyone knows Etsy, yes? There's a great example of Etsy having a lot of conversations about this, telling them what they've been successful with. Talking about, I've been successful with hiring women by doing this. I've been successful with hiring non-Asian minorities by doing this. That's really important because it builds the community and allows us all to learn from someone's experiences. If we're all talking about these things, our teams will be better. It's very easy to ignore this, but it won't get easier if we do ignore it. The number one reason why I think we need diversity inside of our teams, inside of our organizations, is this. The internet is a democratic organization. It has democratized access. It has made everyone able to do anything. The fact that my mom can comment on a blog that the Taliban is commenting on, that like some random person that's in Iowa, then the UK and Africa, etc., all on the same blog is crazy. But the thing is, if I have a team that all looks like me, that's not the internet's users. And we need to build apps that look like the internet, not look like probably our organizations. There's one thing that's most important. I've tried to order these by importance. Diversity is probably, for me, one of the most important. But there's one thing that beats it. And that's simple. It's shipping. How many here have an app that hasn't shipped? I don't believe you. No one, okay, finally one person is brave and says yes. We need to ship these apps. I have many apps that haven't shipped. They're just sitting there and I'm like, maybe I'll ship them. The reason we need to ship them is because suddenly, instead of working for ourselves, which is hard to do, we're working for a user, and that's really important. It really changes the dynamics of the team. It changes the dynamics of everything we're doing. So building a team is really hard, right? But it's especially worth it. Let's talk about practicing failure for a second. Who here loves failing? Woo! I think failing is good. You learn a lot, but it also sucks, right? It doesn't feel good. It's not exciting. We spent a lot of time to be terrible at it. We practiced a lot about how do we really screw up failing. We did this pretty simply. The idea was, first of all, user experience. How do we talk to the users? This was defined. I asked my good buddy Jason, who I hired on the campaign to do user experience. I was like, what is user experience and why do we use it? And he said this. It's very simple. He's like, the difference between functional and usable. There are many apps that are functional. We have these internally. I found every app we had that we built internally was functional. But when you start looking at the users who are using it, and when they're like, yeah, this doesn't work, or I don't use this, it's easier to use paper, which happens a lot. You'd be surprised. We need to talk to those users to build functional and usable. That's incredibly important. Focus on this. A/B testing, obviously, you guys, which one do you like better? We had a previous presenter talk about this. This is, you know this movie, Groundhog Day? It's all about multivariate testing. I was a little bummed that my punchline was blown, but I was watching this with my wife and I was like, hey, this is just about multivariate testing. It literally is. If you watch it, it's just about this guy testing every aspect of his life until he finds the success. We did this aggressively. Every single thing we did, we tested various portions of it, emails, everything. One thing we learned is that from one day to the next, we could not learn. The users just moved on. So one day we'd send an email with a blank subject line, then the rest of the campaign that would fail drastically. We did a lot of internal betting to see what would be successful before some of our campaigns, and we always lost every single time. No one won. I guess the users won. The other aspect of this is just, this allowed us to iterate very quickly because we always knew which way the users were leaning. Fail safety is something that I find fascinating that we don't practice in technology. Did anyone go see this when it was still happening, this shuttle launch? So you did? So there was one person, which is more than any audience I've ever had, US or Europe. No one went to see this, and it's one of the coolest things that I've ever seen in my entire life. So I went and saw this, the last one that happened, and I was at this museum, and they were talking about fail safety. And the idea of fail safety is very simple. When you strap people to a rocket and you shoot them in the air, they need to come back without dying, which usually works, which is also crazy that that works. Usually works that they don't come back dying as well. It also shoots them in the air for sure. But one of the things I noticed is, I came back from this and I was thinking about users, and I was like, we don't do this with our users. We oftentimes are building solutions, whether it's internal tools or external tools, where the users get stuck and they don't return to Earth safely. And what I mean by that is there's default error pages out there that the users are just like, it's like error. And you're like, sweet, that's great, an error. Where do I go? It says, you know, your operation could not complete successfully. It was like that, we saw Adobe Insight up there. It didn't connect to the internet. Then what did it do? It just said error, right? Why wouldn't it say error and then pop up a thing that says, would you like to debug your connection? You know, there's a lot of opportunities to how do we make sure that the users are never in a state where they don't have something to do. We did this with all of our apps, where if there was ever a problem with an app, no matter what it was, it would give the user work to do. So if you went to the call tool, which a lot of users did, millions and millions of users went there. If there was a problem, which there wasn't, but if there were to be a problem, what we would do is we'd pop up something else that says, hey, there's a problem, but we wouldn't actually say there's a problem. We'd just say, hey, why don't you go do work over here now? Or, you know, we've closed your state right now. You need to go over here and knock on some doors. It was this idea of never let the user see failure. Just bounce them someplace where they can do the work. They're there for a reason. For some reason, I myself even found there were places we weren't doing this. 404 pages, DNS, there's all these places to build out where you can just create very simple paths for users when the systems break down. But there's the number one thing that I think we should be all thinking about when we talk about failure and how to avoid it is practice. This is a little bit unintuitive. Anti-intuitive is a new word I just made up. We did this thing called game day. A lot of people call it like tabletop exercises. What we did is we basically destroyed everything. So we went through and we developed this kind of menu. And we gave this menu to everyone in the campaign that was involved with any of the products, from the PMs to the owners to the engineers to the developers and the sysadmins to the users that were using the particular products. And we said, hey, on this day we are going to break it. So just let us know how it works. The idea being that we need to know every single aspect of failure that comes with this app, whether it's externally based, like a giant hurricane that's coming to the East Coast, whether it's a provider that's going down, like Amazon going down on the 22nd of October, not that I would remember that date, or whatever it was, just knowing exactly what that failure is. And so we gave this menu out to our engineers, all of our people, and we said, here's what we're going to do. And the first thing was like, the databases are going to die. And so the databases died, and then everything else died, and then all the engineers and everyone was like, why is everything else dying? And then we were like, because failure doesn't come on a menu, and now we need to fix it. And so we aggressively fixed it. And there's a really great book about why we did this and how we did this that's on Amazon. Dylan Richard is the author. It's free. Go check it out. But this is a really important thing that we learned a lot about. We learned a lot about our organization, we learned a lot about technology, and we learned a lot about one really important thing, which was we did not have any downtime because of this. We had catastrophic failure on election day, and nobody noticed. It was amazing. And the only reason is because we practiced and we knew every single bit about our infrastructure, and we knew exactly how and when things would fail and how to avoid it. So overall, we did not fail, and the reason was because we invested heavily in failure, and it worked out really well. The final thing I want to talk about here is community. We're talking a lot about ads today, which doesn't often have a big community sharing aspect. We see this a little bit, but I think that community in all cases is probably our number one asset. They're usually the power behind the brand. They're usually the people that are pushing. They're usually the people that are proselytizing for us. But we always underestimate the community. How do we facilitate community? We did this a lot at Threadless. community, obviously in a crowdsourced business, is the number one thing. There's nothing else besides the community. And we actually did this a lot where we would launch a product and the community would be like, it's a stupid part. And then we'd be like, okay, because we spent all this time building it and we just cut it. Because we knew that they were right. And that's kind of Burger King, which kind of sucks. But they really are right. And there were a couple reasons why and how we empowered them. Authenticity. So there's this dude named Charlie. Charlie was one of our, I'm going to blind him. Charlie was one of our community managers. And he kind of just hung out. And everyone was like, why is he hanging out? The reason he hung out was because he was exactly our customer. Exactly. He was like 22. We didn't pay him anything. And I guess we could have fixed that, but then he wouldn't have been our customer, right? And he wore T-shirts every day. And the most important thing was he was instant focus group. We would say, Charlie, what do you think of this? And he'd be like, oh, that's great. And then we knew, for the most part, that it would be great. And this allowed us to build an authentic community from the inside, because when the community looked at us, when they looked at pictures of us, when they looked at press about us, they saw themselves. We used all of ourselves as models for all of our photography. That did change after I left, and then the community revolted. They were like, what are all these pretty people? But when we use these pictures of ourselves, the reason was because we were making T-shirts and apparel for the world. We weren't making T-shirts and apparel for super attractive men and women, which was great. That means people bought it. That means they saw themselves. They really projected themselves onto the community because they trusted us. Purpose. I didn't really know what to talk about this until the campaign. I knew this was important, and I'd always say purpose, T-shirts. No one has a real excitement about, well, certain people have an excitement about T-shirts, I do. But there's not a lot of excitement about T-shirts. But when you talk about politics, this is the president signing, I think, healthcare, which you guys probably would be like, oh, healthcare, that's great. But for Americans, this is like Star Trek. Like, this is some serious shit, man. So this is, this is the president signing healthcare, and the people in the campaign saw this, and they were like, we're going to live. This will save our children. This will make it so we don't have to pay money for things that are insane. And this gave purpose. So when you talk to people and you said, why are you here? Why are you volunteering? They would just kind of point to this. And that really helped the community talk to one another. There are hundreds of examples of this with the campaign. There's many inside of your brands that you're probably not thinking of. And this is another reason to talk to your users. Empowerment. This is something we did at the campaign at Threadless aggressively. The idea here is, how do you give the users really the tools that you have internally? We did this at Threadless, where we had this problem where we had a lot of people uploading really shitty designs, just terrible designs that were great, but they would be great. They weren't great when they uploaded them first. So we created this tool called Critique. And all this was something that we were doing internally, where some of our designers would email a user and say, hey, your design, it wasn't that great. Why don't you tweak it over here? Why don't you do this thing? And it was taking a lot of work. So we decided, hey, let's build this tool for our users. So all they would do is they would participate, they would log in, they'd be able to say, hey, I think this is what could be improved, or this is improved, and then you'd have this little thing. Is it ready to go, or does it need work? And you'd kind of go back and forth, and then we'd have different versions. And so it was this idea of, how do you do versions of assets? How do you do this? This is a really neat thing, because the users then helped each other, which was something we were doing as a company, but the users did it, which meant we didn't have to do it. So we really empowered them. They also felt that they were more a part of the community by helping one another. We see this a lot. It's another example. I mean, terrorism too, but we see like the idea of, how do you give moderation? How do you give control? How do you give the tools that you're using to the users? This happens all the time, and this is often an afterthought. Oh no, we need to moderate content. But the important part about this is, the users are excited to feel like they have the power to help shape their community. There's one thing I want to talk about a little bit here that's really, really important. It's safety. Who knows this guy? This is actually on my laptop, and I always feel bad, like it's on a sticker on the back, because I think this is one of the worst things in the world, right? You have the normal person, right? You add a little anonymity, you add some audience, terrible person, and it's this. You guys know this? It really is true, right? Facebook's kind of changed this, but for the most part, this is still true. When you have a community and you add anonymous people, and then you just give them an audience, they will act out, they will be crazy, and they will turn into a total dickwad, apparently. But trust is really important. So trusting your user, adding trust, enabling trust for your user. You don't want to be this, right? This happens a lot. We create these neighborhoods, and they get burnt out. they're not safe. The user doesn't trust it. They don't feel safe. So make sure you're building a good neighborhood. This is the thing that I think people forget about. When you have those burnt out lots, you have those burnt out cars, no one wants to be there. But if it's good, the people will move there and you have this kind of field of dreams kind of experience. So we have to create that environment. We have to create that neighborhood. So this is about it. So remember, build a great team, practice failure, and facilitate community, and ship. And I think everything will work out. Thanks.